Hello, I'm John Barron and welcome to The Context, where each week we'll slow down the news cycle and put major stories and important issues into historical, international, scientific and social context. We'll look at where we are, how we got here and try and find out where we may be headed next. This week, the decades-long battle against smoking has seen millions of Australians quit, but more than 1 in 10 adults still smoke. What more can be done? Is vaping part of the solution or a whole new problem? But first, since the Russian invasion in late February, there have been numerous alleged war crimes committed against Ukrainians. And increasingly, Russia's tactics, including the relentless bombardment of Ukrainian cities and mass killings of civilians, are being described as an act of genocide.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russian forces of committing genocide in towns near the capital, Kyiv.
Це військові злочини, і це буде визнано світом як геноцид.
Yes, I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian.
That word genocide has particular resonance for Ukrainians who suffered through an act of genocide at the hands of Russia once before. One that was all but hidden for more than 50 years. It's now known as the Holodomor.
Holodomor literally means death by hunger.
That's Dr. Ole Volovena. He's spent years in Russian and Ukrainian archives piecing together the scale of the Holodomor.
There were approximately 4 million deaths caused by the famine in Ukraine, which is equivalent to 13% of the total population of Ukraine in 1933.
For decades, history referred to a great famine in the Soviet Union in 1932 and 1933, when a large number of people were known to have starved to death. It's only since the fall of the Soviet Union, though, that the truth has gradually come to light.
It was a deliberate weapon of terror.
The famine was not caused by crop failure or drought. It was man-made collective punishment for defying Moscow. The food shortage was partly caused by the confiscation of grain from Ukraine. As Soviet leader Joseph Stalin forced small farms to collectivise into large state-run farms and set impossibly high quotas. Many Ukrainians resisted giving up their farms and their grain, so Stalin's forces moved in and took everything.
In very many cases, they took away all the food, not just the grain. So the household was left without any food.
Shops and pantries were raided, livestock was taken, even family pets that could have been eaten were removed. Stalin then sealed Ukraine's borders and locked down the villages, so there was no escaping the rising tide of hunger.
Basically, the Ukrainian farmers were prisoners of their village and they were condemned to death by starvation.
And die they did in astonishing numbers.
At the peak of the famine, which is June of 1933, there were 28,000 deaths per day.
There were tens of thousands of executions and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian landowners, political and cultural figures were deported to forced labour camps or simply disappeared. And then Stalin covered it up.
After the famine, Stalin denied that there was a famine. Just to mention there was a famine, you were put in prison. Just like today, if you say there's a war in Ukraine, you are put in prison in Russia.
For many years, Ukrainians didn't dare talk about the Holodomor, but they remembered.
There was a collective trauma that people, they were not able to talk about it, to process what they went through, and there was horrible situations. There were cases of cannibalism, children were kidnapped. It was whole villages were practically empty, everybody died.
In recent years, memorials to the victims of the Holodomor have been erected in Ukraine and the silence has been broken. And Ole Volovena says that this helps explain the level of resistance to Russian aggression in Ukraine today.
Hunger was used as a weapon of terror, just like Putin today is bombarding civilians as a means of terrorizing the population. It's a very similar situation.
Later on The Context, we'll talk to the former Health Minister who led the world in stripping cigarette makers of their identity. But right now, let's see how attitudes towards smoking have changed or not changed in a segment we're calling Now and Then. The Context's Ange Lavoie-Pierre took to the streets to ask some of the same questions the ABC asked Australians back when the first health warnings about smoking were being raised in 1960.
Smoking, street interviews, Sydney.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, I'll ask you something in a tick.
Can I ask you a quick question for the ABC?
What are your feelings about smoking and this current anti-smoking campaign?
I've smoked for years and I think I'm still likely to continue with it.
What's your feeling about smoking and public health efforts to stop smoking?
As a smoker, I feel like I started socially smoking and then it's just like continued from that.
Because I don't think you should smoke. I think if you were meant to smoke, you'd have a chimney on your head.
It's not too good for you. It cuts down your wind a bit and not as healthy as you was when you weren't smoking.
I'm very much against kids smoking.
Well, tobacco's a killer.
A lot of smoking happens around other people who don't like it.
What's your feeling about smoking and the public health effort to stop smoking?
I smoke. I come from the 80s era where everyone smoked, and so, I mean, it's pretty unaffordable too.
I went past someone buying a packet of cigarettes the other day in the shop and it was $44 or something for a packet of cigarettes.
I think it's expensive.
It costs money and it's not worth it, I don't know.
How can people afford that?
Do you worry about the impact on your health?
Well, I'm 74, from a long line of smokers who all lived into their 90s.
My father, who died at 96, and he smoked and chewed.
Really, I just won't go along with it until it is actually proven, and it hasn't been proven yet.
The evidence is there that smoking cigarettes will make you sick and you'll die younger. So whatever we can do to discourage people to smoke, I think is really important.
What do you reckon it would take for you to quit?
Probably a health scare or something like that.
You've never thought of giving it up?
Oh, very often, but I've never succeeded in doing so. I enjoy it too much.
What are your feelings about smoking and this anti-smoking campaign?
I don't think it's much good if a burglar come in to kill you. You wouldn't you wouldn't be friendly with him, would you?
People have reasons for smoking. You can't just say stop smoking. You have to deal with the reasons why they smoke as much as the problem itself.
What about vapes? Have you ever given that a try?
Yeah, I mean, vapes are massive. I feel like everyone is vaping.
I think they should be banned.
A lot of my friends do, and they hate it. They're addicted. They don't want to be on it anymore.
What are your feelings about smoking and the anti-smoking campaign?
Well, I think it's just a matter of choice. If a person wants to smoke and they want to die, let them smoke and die. If they don't, well, give it up.
31.
Not that long ago, it seemed like everyone smoked. Pipes, cigars, whatever this is.
I am executively 3 inches high, and it is a very good height indeed.
Most of all, though, people smoked cigarettes. Lots and lots of cigarettes. They handed them out for free if you're in the armed forces. And by the end of World War II in 1945, 72% of Australian men and 26% of women smoked. You could smoke at the pub, club or restaurant, on a plane, on a train, the bus. Taxis and cars all had ashtrays, and it wasn't just people who smoked either. That can't be good for them. And cigarette ads were everywhere.
Let me go out the length of them. This would have to be the best cigarette value in Australia today. No risk.
Plenty of risk, actually. Doctors had been warning about the rising rate of tobacco-related cancers since the 1920s. So what did the tobacco companies do? They got other doctors to help them sell more cigarettes.
Doctors in all parts of the country were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?"
But after a while, people couldn't help but notice a lot of people who smoked were dying at comparatively young ages. The King of England, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, a famous singer. It wasn't until 1964, though, the US Surgeon General announced,
"It is a judgment of the committee that cigarette smoking contributes substantially to mortality from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate."
At the time, the media seemed more concerned about the economic impact on tobacco producers than the health of smokers.
At stake are the incomes of 750,000 families who farm the nation's 5th largest cash crop, the jobs of 96,000 men and women involved in tobacco manufacturing, The $8 billion a year tobacco industry, which pays more than $3 billion in federal, state, and local taxes, and $150 million worth of cigarette advertising.
Oh, smoother Newport. According to this nationwide survey,
TV and radio stations and the print media got an awful lot of money out of tobacco. So did politicians. When official warnings appeared on packets of cigarettes in the US 2 years later, they were a somewhat vague caution. Cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health. The 1960s saw a more concerted effort, though, to better educate the public about the dangers of smoking.
This man used to be a heavy smoker. Now he's a helpless invalid.
But smoking was still everywhere. In Australia, it wasn't until 1973 that the first warnings appeared. Smoking is a health hazard. The tobacco industry did what it could to delay and dilute those warnings. They even argued turning people off cigarettes would only encourage them to take up other drugs instead. Broadcasting tobacco advertisements was gradually phased out through the 1970s. By then, adult male smoking was down to 43%, while 1/3 of women smoked after cigarettes were aggressively marketed to the women's liberation generation.
Tailored for the feminine hand. Slimmer than the fat cigarettes men smoke, with the kind of flavour women like.
Magazines and newspapers were still full of cigarette ads until the 1990s. Sponsorship of major sports made sure that tobacco brands were still seen on TV screens into the 2000s. It took until 1987 for smokers to be warned smoking causes lung cancer, smoking damages your lungs, and smoking causes heart disease. Since then, sponsorship bans, point-of-sale advertising bans, more graphic and dire warnings, plain packaging and bans on smoking in indoor and many outdoor public spaces have all helped to drive smoking rates down dramatically, to under 13% of men and 9% of women. But the price is still being paid. More than 20,000 Australians die from smoking-related disease each year, making it the leading risk factor that contributed to disease burden and deaths at an astonishing human cost of 430,000 years of healthy life. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Australians are taking up e-cigarettes. To some, vaping is a safer alternative to smoking and maybe a way to quit tobacco. Others fear it's creating a new generation of nicotine addicts carrying its own inherent health risks and may be a gateway to tobacco use. We've seen how the fight against tobacco smoking has been fought on many fronts. In recent years, perhaps the most dramatic and controversial step was the decision by the last federal Labor government to introduce generic plain packaging, replacing the brand of cigarette with a drab green and graphic photos of the diseases smoking is known to cause. Nicola Roxon was the Health Minister chiefly responsible for that change. And for her, it was a public health battle with a personal motivation.
My father died at quite a young age as a result of tobacco-related disease. However, the idea and the passion didn't come from that. It was really just an extra motivator. The idea came from the brilliant public health work of many people decades in the lead up to me being Health Minister, and the ideas had been there for some time and there was an opportunity for us to grab. But certainly when you've felt that impact at a family level, the motivation to make sure other families didn't have to lose their loved ones when this was entirely preventable certainly added an extra edge to that campaign for me.
So tell us, when you were Health Minister, how did the plain packaging policy come about?
The idea had been kicking around in public health debate for some time, but we set up a task force that provided a whole lot of suggested actions we could take in tobacco control, in alcohol, in dealing with the growing problems of obesity. And it was really clear to me as Health Minister that sort of the decades of work that had led up to the public having a really good understanding about the dangers of tobacco, yet us still seeing new people taking it on, that this was an opportunity really to harness that public understanding and try to knock out smoking as something that the next generations would just never get hooked to. And so the way that tobacco is appealing, the way that packets looked, making them uglier, making it, you know, embarrassing for people to have them on the table at the pub or something like that, was really clear, constructive next step for us to take, and part of, you know, momentum that had really grown over a long time in Australia, and I was proud that we could take the next step, and it's helped with momentum in other countries around the world too. So that's where it came from. It wasn't an idea that I thought up myself, but it was one that we needed to use some political will and determination and focus to make sure we could get it through.
And what sort of opposition did you face from the tobacco companies, stripping them of their branding and their identities? They'd invested a lot in that over the years. They had a lot to lose.
They did, but I think that tobacco companies have really taken the same strategy time and time again with each step that has put the health of consumers ahead of the financial interests of tobacco companies. So really the tactics that we faced were the similar ones that were faced when advertising and sponsorship was taken out of sport, when there were restrictions on TV advertising. So we weren't surprised about the tactics, legal tactics, you know, scare campaigns that this would what we would do in the future for chocolate. If you could do it for tobacco, you could also do it for chocolate, you know, the sorts of things that we were well prepared for. But the interesting thing is it is a very legal approach that they take increasingly, and that meant that the Australian government faced challenges in our High Court, in the WTO, in all sorts of different forums, and we won each of those battles, but it did mean we had to be determined to put aside money to fight those battles, and I think the tobacco industry around the world has been very good at scaring countries off taking action because of the potential cost. But all of that pales into insignificance when you think about the cost to families and the health system from tobacco-related disease.
Given that none of these measures to curb smoking happen in isolation, is it possible to quantify the impact that plain packaging alone has had?
Well, there is research that was undertaken, and we made sure actually as a government that we funded some of that post-implementation assessment. So there are measures that show the impact that it's had. But I think you're right to point out that no single step on its own actually gets you to the point that we are in Australia, where very, very small numbers of secondary school children ever will smoke. You know, that's a great triumph, but it's come from lots of different steps along the way, and there now being very wide public understanding about the harms of smoking. I do have some worries though that we need to keep doing that for each new generation, so there's not a risk of sliding backwards. And we need to look at what new threats there might be. And I don't think the industry has earned the right to be trusted, which is kind of their argument on vaping. Look, trust us, it's not as bad as tobacco, you know, at least it will help some people quit, when really the early signs are it's actually being used as an entry product back into smoking. So I think we have to be careful. We shouldn't overstate the impact of any single measure. We need to look at it comprehensively, but we shouldn't underestimate that each step builds to a very powerful public health result.
And finally, Nicola Roxon, you've had more than a decade to look back. Is there something else that you would have liked to have done to try and combat smoking when you were in office that for whatever reason just wasn't possible?
Oh look, I think as a health minister there's an unlimited amount of things that you can do. In tobacco control, I'm really proud that this was the next important step. And you have to remember, we actually also got an additional benefit from the very aggressive approach that the tobacco industry took, which was 2 or 3 years of free advertising about the public health message, because this was a contentious action to take, and we talked about the harms of tobacco consistently in the free media during all that time as well. So I don't feel that there was another step that needed to be taken right then. I'm a believer that you have to use your political momentum in a targeted way, but I think we're now at a different point where we're looking at the retailing of tobacco, looking at the different types of marketing that's used with our new social media, looking at vaping as a serious risk and possibly a renormalisation or re-entry for people back into smoking as a problem that needs to be dealt with. So there's plenty still to do, but I'm pleased that we took the step that we did as a component of a long-going campaign against tobacco in Australia that's been led by some amazing public health research and activists.
Nicola Roxon, thank you for being with us on The Context.
Thank you.
Let's get some context around who smokes in 2022. Here's Madeline Morris.
We've seen how smoking rates in Australia have fallen dramatically since the 1940s and 50s. But while the overall picture is looking much better, there are still parts of our community where either the health messages aren't getting through or other issues are stopping people from quitting. While overall 11% of Australians smoke daily, the rate is more than 3 times higher among Indigenous Australians, although that is down from closer to 45% a decade ago. The 2010s showed a significant fall in the number of gay, lesbian and bisexual people who smoked, down from 28% to 16%. Studies have suggested smoking rates among transgender people are still well above 30%. People experiencing problems with their mental health are much more likely to be smokers. More than 30% of people with social phobias smoke. That increases to more than half of all people with general anxiety and 2/3 of people experiencing some form of psychotic disorder. Where you live can also be an indicator of whether you're more likely to smoke. People living in remote areas smoke at a rate of around 20%. It's 13% in the regions and around just 10% in our cities. What's more, people in the lowest income areas are almost 4 times more likely to smoke than those in the richest areas. The highest smoking rates are now among people in their 50s, followed by the 40-somethings. Fewer than 5% of people aged over 70 smoke, in part simply because many older male smokers have died. People in their 20s were the biggest smokers 20 years ago. Of course, they're the smokers in their 40s today. 20-somethings have fallen from 31% to 13%. What about the cost? Well, the price of cigarettes has increased astronomically thanks to rising tobacco taxes. In 1980, a pack cost just over $1. Now it's close to $50. Adjusted for inflation with a baseline of 2012, that is still a massive 10-fold increase. As a result, rolling your own cigarettes is becoming more popular, up from around a quarter 15 years ago to half of all smokers now, and many of those are under 25. E-cigarettes are increasingly popular too, and this may surprise you. More people these days consume marijuana and cannabis than are daily smokers. And even from those ever-dwindling numbers of daily smokers, most wish they weren't. 7 out of 10 people who smoke say they want to quit.
The former Professor of Public Health at the University of Sydney, Simon Chapman, is concerned the dangers of vaping are being downplayed and it risks creating a new generation of nicotine addicts and smokers too. Chapman has been at the forefront of anti-smoking efforts in Australia for more than 40 years. But here's an interesting piece of context. He's also a former smoker.
I was one of the early smokers at school. I didn't like smoking very much, but it was something you had to carry with you, almost like condoms and being able to buy beer underage and things like that. But I never was really loyal to it, like a lot of smokers are. 90% of smokers regret ever starting to smoke, and I think I probably was one of them. So it wasn't difficult for me to decide that I was going to quit when I did. Now, Simon, going back through our archives, I found this interview you did for the ABC in 1980, 42 years ago. And in it, you denied being involved with defacing cigarette billboards as a part of the so-called Bugger Up campaign.
Much of the opposition's attack has been directed at this man, Dr. Simon Chapman of the Health Promotions Branch, with claims in Parliament that he'd been involved with Bugger Up. Chapman says he's never defaced a billboard, but sympathises with some sentiments expressed in Bugger Up campaigns.
Now, Professor Chapman, was that true? Were you really not involved in the Bugger Up campaign at all?
Oh, look, I knew the people who were involved in it, and I can say now that I did a few boards. I didn't do many, but the people who did a lot, and they were very, very brave and principled people. When I mentioned that we were getting Paul Hogan, trying to get him removed from the Winfield campaign, we actually held a public meeting in the city morgue in Parramatta Road, in the lecture theatre there, and some people came along and said, look, writing letters to committees and complaint tribunals and things is all very well, but we should go out and take direct action. And I think some of them have been doing it individually, but they gained membership that night, and it became literally a national phenomenon.
These days, Simon Chapman, vaping is seen by some as a form of harm minimisation, a safer alternative to smoking. Are you concerned, though, about the motives behind that, particularly when we see big tobacco companies getting into the vaping business?
Very much so. Some of my biggest concerns are with flavourants, for example. There are 2.7 million people in Australia with asthma, many of whom use puffers. None of those products are flavoured, and none of the companies marketing them have ever tried to get them flavoured, because they know that it's not a good idea to inhale flavouring chemicals day in and day out. The average vapor who smokes daily takes about 500 to 600 puffs, and we really have no idea what the long-term consequences of that are going to be. So anyone who says to you, vaping, it's all but benign, 95% less dangerous than cigarettes, those type of throwaway lines, really doesn't know what they're talking about. We didn't know how dangerous cigarettes were for 20, 30, 40 years down the track after they were mass marketed at the beginning of the 20th century. And the third proposition about vaping is that, it's a marvellous thing for getting people off smoking. And there is a strong case for suggesting that vaping holds more people in smoking than it tips out of it. And it's also possibly an on-ramp for a number of kids who probably would have not used nicotine in any form whatsoever, but are now vaping and may go on to take up smoking at a later date.
How different do you think the battle against vaping will be, given that it's already illegal to sell nicotine vapes, but people seem to have no trouble getting a hold of them?
Well, look, we made every possible mistake in the regulation of tobacco products because we didn't know what the diabolical consequences of so many people using them were. We need not make that mistake again, and that's why I'm and all my colleagues are right behind the Australian initiative of making access to these products via prescription. And we hope that the government, which has just been elected, will get rid of the personal importation scheme, which is allowing people to bring in, in bulk a lot of these products. I've been told that you can land them for about $1, and if you can sell them for about $20 to $25, and there is a lot of people who are engaged in that at the moment. That needs to be stopped in its tracks.
Simon, we spoke earlier to former Health Minister Nicola Roxon about her introduction of plain cigarette packaging. I wonder, what would your advice be to the incoming government? Is there something of that sort of scale that they should be looking at now?
Nicola Roxon was the most amazing, incredible leader I think any of us have ever seen. She acted boldly. The government that we've got now should be bold. We're at the beginning of a term, and they should fix the vaping problem very quickly, and that will be copied all around the world, and Australia will do it again.
Simon Chapman, thank you for being with us on The Context.
Thanks, John.
And that's all for The Context. Next week marks 50 years since the Watergate break-in that led to the only ever resignation of an American president. We'll look at Watergate's lasting legacy with a lawyer and a reporter who are in the thick of it all. See you then.